The silence came first, not the comfortable silence of an empty room, nor the reverent hush of a concert hall as the orchestra lifts its bows. This was a different kind of silence, the held breath, collective stillness of 300 people who had all, in the same instant, turned their eyes toward the arched doorway of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom and felt something shift in the air, something they could not immediately name. But that moment was still 7 hours away. For now, the ballroom was alive with the particular energy of people performing their wealth for one another. Crystal chandelier light cascaded across the room in fragments, catching on diamond earrings, on champagne flutes, on the carefully lacquered hair of women who had spent entire afternoons preparing for exactly this evening. The string quartet in the corner was playing Debussy with the careful precision of musicians who understood that no one was actually listening, but that the music needed to exist regardless. A kind of sonic wallpaper, a texture, not a sound. And standing near the center of the room, already certain she was its axis, was Elodie Voss. She had arrived 45 minutes early. Not from eagerness, she would have told anyone who asked, but from strategy. The entrance mattered. The entrance was everything. And if you arrived when the room was already full, you were just another face in the crowd. Elodie Voss did not do crowds. Elodie Voss did entrances. She had chosen a gown that demanded attention the way a thunderclap demands attention. Immediately, completely, without asking permission. It was a confection of silver and champagne sequins, and every inch of it catching and throwing light so aggressively that it was almost impossible to look directly at her for long. Which was, she had decided, precisely the point. She wanted people to squint. She wanted to be the brightest object in any room she entered. Her hair was swept back and pinned with a brooch she'd had made, white gold and pavé diamonds. And her posture, as she moved through the early arriving guests, was that of a woman who had never, not once in her adult life, doubted her right to occupy space. Theron Whitmore, her companion, stood at her side with the particular kind of stillness that could be mistaken for contentment by anyone who didn't look closely. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, in the way of old athletes gone soft, and with silver threading through his dark hair, and a face that had once been striking and was now merely authoritative. He held his Scotch glass with the practiced ease of a man who had stood in ballrooms exactly like this one for decades, and he smiled at the right moments, and he introduced Elodie to the right people. And if his eyes drifted occasionally toward the doorway, Elodie attributed it to nothing more significant than distraction. She was wrong about that. But then, Elodie was wrong about a great many things that evening. She was discussing the room's floral arrangements with a woman named Priscilla Beaumont, wife of a hedge fund manager, inoffensive presence, the kind of person whose primary social function was to be an appreciative audience, when she noticed the woman near the east window. The woman was standing alone, but she held no drink. She wore a simple, dove-grey dress, nothing remarkable, nothing that would earn a second glance in a room like this. And she was looking at the room with an expression of such quiet, undisturbed calm that Elodie found it faintly offensive. No one stood alone and calm at these events. You were either performing or you were irrelevant, and irrelevant people didn't get through the door. "Who is that?" Elodie asked Priscilla, tilting her chin toward the east window. Priscilla glanced over. "Oh, I'm not entirely sure. She came in with Jeffrey Aldrin, I think. Perhaps a +1. Elodie studied the woman for a moment longer. Late 30s, possibly early 40s. No jewelry visible, except what appeared to be a small gold ring on her right hand. Brown hair worn simply, without styling that announced effort. She looked, as Elodie thought, like someone who had wandered in from a completely different kind of life. A librarian, perhaps, an academic. Someone who had borrowed the grey dress from a more appropriately dressed friend. Elodie turned back to Priscilla and smiled. "Well," she said pleasantly, "I suppose these events attract all kinds." Priscilla gave a small, uncertain laugh. The woman at the east window did not look over at them. She simply continued to survey the room with that expression of undisturbed calm, as though she were reading a landscape she had known a long time ago and was simply confirming that it had not changed. She had not changed her expression once when Elodie's gaze landed on her. She would not change it once for the rest of the evening. Her name was Celine Whitmore, and she owned every room she walked into, including this one, including, in fact, the building itself. Welcome to a story of truth, vanity, and the moment a temporary throne met its real owner. Before we step into story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone was performing confidence so loudly that you could feel the effort behind it? Hold that thought. Let's begin. The Whitmore Grand had been in the family since 1923. This was a fact that Elodie knew in the abstract, the way one knows that a building has a history without particularly caring about what that history contains. It was a beautiful space, soaring ceilings with original plasterwork, restored twice in the last century, parquet floors that had been walked by foreign dignitaries and business magnates, and once 3 presidents from 3 different decades. The estate itself, the hotel, and the adjoining commercial property, the portfolio of secondary holdings that had accumulated around the Whitmore name like barnacles on an old ship, was, by any reasonable assessment, generational wealth of the most serious variety. What Elodie also knew, or believed she knew, which in her experience amounted to the same thing, was that Theron was the heir to all of it. This was partially true. The part she had not fully investigated, because it had not occurred to her that investigation would ever be necessary, was the question of exactly how that inheritance was structured. She had met Theron 2 years ago at a fundraising dinner in Geneva. He had been charming, attentive, free with his credit card in ways that Elodie found deeply appealing and separated from his wife, and which he had mentioned on the second date with the casual ease of someone reading from a prepared statement. The separation had been going on for 18 months. They were working things out. It was complicated. There was no drama, no conflict, just 2 people who had grown in different directions and were allowing the distance to formalize itself naturally. Elodie had nodded with the sympathy of someone who had absolutely no intention of allowing 18 months of separation to become 19. By the end of that year, she had moved into Theron's London apartment. By the beginning of this one, she had begun referring to it as her apartment. She had replaced the spare bedroom's furniture with a vanity she'd imported from Paris. She had rearranged the kitchen to her preference. And she had, and this was the detail she was most proud of, redecorated the entrance hall in a way that removed every remaining trace of the woman who had lived there before her. Or so she believed. She had not, in those 2 years, seen a single photograph of Celine Whitmore. Theron kept none. The apartment, by the time Elodie arrived, had already been stripped of most personal traces, as though a moving crew had come through and removed everything with a face in it. She had asked once what his wife looked like, and Theron had said, "quiet," in the tone of a man who meant it as a description rather than a compliment, and Elodie had been satisfied with that because quiet sounded like no competition at all. She had pictured someone mousy, someone who had not known what to do with what Theron offered and had slowly faded away. Someone who, if she were here tonight, which she was not, obviously, would blend invisibly into the background. She had, in other words, pictured the woman at the east window almost exactly and had dismissed her just as quickly. What Elodie could not know, what she had built her entire sense of this situation around not knowing, was that Celine Whitmore had never faded. She had simply stepped back. There is a difference, and it is the difference between a candle going out and a candle being placed in a room with the curtains drawn. The light is still there. It is simply waiting for the curtains to open. The party circulated. More guests arrived. Theron performed his hosting duties with the polished ease of habit, moving through the room with his hand at Elodie's back, making introductions, accepting compliments on her dress with a brief, unacknowledging smile that stopped just short of warmth. He laughed at the right moments. He was, in all the ways that could be observed from the outside, the picture of a man at ease. Elodie watched herself reflected in the room's approval, in the way eyes tracked her sequined gown, in the compliments that came her way, in the slightly widened gaze of a younger woman near the bar who seemed dazzled by her presence, and felt the satisfaction of someone who has prepared for exactly this occasion and finds that the preparation has paid off. She crossed the room toward the drinks table, accepting a fresh glass of champagne from a passing server with the automatic grace of someone who had been accepting things from other people her entire life. Near the drinks table, she found herself standing next to a man in a dark suit whom she vaguely recognized as someone in property development. She had met him at a dinner of Theron's, or possibly a lunch. She couldn't quite place the occasion. And he was already mid-conversation with someone, though he paused when he saw her and offered the brief, polite acknowledgement of a person who does not intend to extend the conversation but does not wish to be rude. "Lovely evening," she offered. "Yes," he agreed, and his gaze shifted somewhere just past her left shoulder, and his expression changed in a way she could not immediately interpret. A kind of recalibration, almost, as though something he had not expected had arrived within his sightline. She turned to look, assuming some later arrival had caught his attention. The east window was empty. The woman in the grey dress had gone. Elodie turned back to her champagne. She did not notice the brief, controlled smile that moved across the property developer's face as he excused himself and moved away from her. She did not notice that he moved in the direction of the main corridor, the one that led to the estate's private entrance. She was examining the flower arrangement on the drinks table, deciding it was slightly unimaginative and feeling pleasantly superior about this observation. We've all watched someone feel like the most powerful person in a room while the room quietly disagrees. Next is where the cracks appear. Not loudly, but the way dawn appears, gradually and then all at once. Theron Whitmore was, by every visible metric, a successful man. He had the properties, the London apartment, the estate in Shropshire, just the flat in Geneva, and the cars, and the club memberships, and the easy fluency with money that comes from having always had it. He had a tailor on Savile Row who knew his measurements by heart, and a cellar of wine that had been appraised 2 years ago at a sum that made his accountant's expression go carefully neutral. He had a reputation in the city that, while not warmly regarded, was regarded seriously, which in certain circles amounts to the same thing. What Theron also had, though this was less visible and considerably less comfortable, was a financial situation that had been quietly deteriorating for the better part of 18 months. It had started, as these things often do, not with a single catastrophic event, but with a series of decisions that had each seemed reasonable in isolation, and a leverage position on a commercial real estate fund that had been caught off guard by an interest rate movement, a secondary investment in a tech infrastructure company that had, after an initially promising quarter, begun to behave in ways the prospectus had not anticipated, a restructuring of the Whitmore family holdings that had been initiated 5 years prior as a piece of estate planning and which had turned out to have tax implications that were now making themselves felt in ways that required very expensive legal counsel to manage. None of this was public. Theron had been careful, meticulous even, about managing the optics. He had paid the right bills. He had maintained the right accounts. He had continued to appear, at every event like this one, as a man with no financial anxieties whatsoever. But the people who mattered knew. In the world that Theron inhabited, information moved through a subterranean network of private conversations and informal confidences, and things shared over a glass of something. There were no announcements, no press releases. There were just glances that lasted a half-second too long, and invitations that didn't arrive, and conversations that steered quietly away from his current investments when they might otherwise have circled toward them. Theron had been noticing this for about 3 months. He had said nothing to Elodie because saying it would require him to account for it, and accounting for it would require admissions that he was not yet prepared to make. It was easier, much easier, to maintain the forward momentum of their life together and trust that the situation would resolve itself before it required transparency. This was, he recognized, a strategy with significant risks attached to it. He was standing near the fireplace in the ballroom's eastern alcove, away from the center of things, which was where Elodie preferred to be, and where therefore she currently was, nursing a second scotch and having a conversation with a man named Fletcher Rowe, who was a barrister with the kind of practice that made him useful to have at parties, but not entirely comfortable to speak with, because Fletcher Rowe had the particular quality of listening to what you were not saying with the same attention he gave to what you were. "Fine evening," Theron said, which was how men like them began conversations that were not actually about the evening. "Very fine," Fletcher agreed. "Full house tonight. I noticed you've extended the invitations beyond the usual circle." "The occasion called for it." Fletcher nodded, examining his wineglass. "I imagine you've received the documentation from Hartley's?" Theron's jaw tightened by a fraction. "I have." And it's being handled." Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "Of course," he said finally. "These things always are." He said it in the tone of a man who had seen many things not, in fact, be handled, and was maintaining the courtesy of not saying so. Theron looked out across the room. He could see Elodie from here, the champagne sequins catching every light in the room, her laugh carrying faintly over the noise of the party. And she was in her element, genuinely and completely, and there was a part of him that found this almost touching. She had worked so hard at this version of herself. She had polished it so carefully. He wished, very briefly, that he felt something warmer watching her. He thought about Celine instead, as he did with increasing frequency these days, not with longing exactly. Their marriage had long since moved past the territory of longing into something quieter and more complicated, but with a specific kind of missing. The way you might miss a room that you had furnished over years and then left, not the room itself, but the accumulated care of it. He had not spoken to her in 4 months. He did not know, had chosen not to know, where she was. He did know, with the certainty of a man whose financial instincts were, however recently compromised, had always been essentially sound, that her silence was not accidental. Celine had never, in 20 years of marriage, done anything by accident. "Excuse me," he said to Fletcher, who nodded without expression and turned back to his wine. Theron moved through the party with the practiced ease of a man who has performed this function many times. He accepted a third scotch. He spoke to 4 people in 4 minutes, each conversation brief and sufficient. He did not find what he was looking for because he did not know precisely what he was looking for, except that it had something to do with the quality of the room's attention and the way it seemed, just slightly, to be redirected tonight, not focused on him in the way he was accustomed to, not quite. At the bar, he overheard 2 women speaking in low voices, and one of them, Miriam Carlyle, he registered, whose husband ran a private equity firm, was saying something with a suppressed smile, and the other was nodding with wide eyes. He caught 2 words before they noticed him and adjusted their expressions. The words were, "finally," and "tonight." He finished his scotch. He thought about the blue pearl that had arrived at the apartment 3 days ago, delivered in a small white box with no note, addressed to him in handwriting he had not seen in 4 months, but recognized as immediately and completely as he would have recognized his own. He had placed it on the mantelpiece in the study. He had not mentioned it to Elodie. It's funny how the loudest person in the room is often the most vulnerable. But Elodie is about to spend the next chapter of this evening entirely confident, while the walls are very quietly closing in around her. Next is where preparation meets its reckoning. 3 weeks before this evening, Elodie had gone to Versailles. Not to the palace itself. She had been there, done her part of being photographed before it, and found the whole thing less impressive than she'd expected. But to a small atelier on a side street behind the Marché Saint-Pierre, run by a designer named Christophe, who specialized in what he called haute brilliance, which meant in practice that everything he made caught the light and demanded to be seen. She had described what she wanted with the authority of someone who understood their own vision completely. The biggest thing in the room, the thing people photograph first. She had shown him a reference images from her phone. American awards ceremonies, Monaco parties, the kind of social media posts that measured success in seconds of screen time. She had wanted sequins. She had wanted them in champagne and silver. She had wanted a neckline that announced intention and a hem that swept the floor with the authority of someone who owned the floor. Christophe had made exactly what she asked for. It was, by every objective standard, a spectacular dress. The sequins were hand-stitched, 6,000 of them, each one placed with the kind of obsessive precision that commanded the price tag Elodie had paid without hesitation. The silhouette was impeccable. The color, that particular shade of champagne gold that worked with her dark hair and golden skin, was precisely right. It was, without question, was designed to be the most noticed thing in any room it entered. This was, it would turn out, a different goal than being the most admired. While Elodie's dress was being completed in Paris, a different appointment was taking place in a studio in a converted 19th-century building in Lyon. The studio belonged to a woman named Geneviève Aubert, who had been working in couture for 31 years and who had, over the course of those 31 years, dressed precisely the kind of woman who required no fanfare because she carried her own gravity wherever she went. Geneviève did not advertise. She did not have a website that invited new clients. Her clients came to her through a very specific kind of introduction, the kind that was made quietly and by people who understood that there was a difference between dressing beautifully and dressing to be seen. Soline Whitmore had been a client for 11 years. The gown that was now in its final fitting stage had been in development for 6 weeks. It was built on a foundation of structured silk blend jacquard, the kind of fabric that held its shape with architectural precision without being stiff, that moved with the body rather than around it. The color had required 3 rounds of discussion with Genevieve's dye specialist before it was exactly right. Not navy, not cobalt, not the bright electric blue of costume jewelry. Mazarine, a blue so deep and specific that it had its own name in French. Named, Genevieve had mentioned, with her characteristically understated pleasure, for Cardinal Mazarin, who had understood that the most powerful things do not announce themselves. Soline stood in the fitting room in her bare feet, which she preferred to heels during fittings because heels changed the way she held her weight, and she wanted to understand how the gown felt before she added that variable. Genevieve circled her slowly, examining the French seams, hand-stitched, encased, entirely invisible from the outside, creating a finish that was clean as a line of calligraphy. The bodice was fitted through the torso, not tightly, but with the precision of a garment that had been drafted specifically for this body and no other, and the skirt moved from the hip in a long, unhurried line that did not flare dramatically, but rather swept in the manner of something that did not need drama. "The sleeve," Soline said. Genevieve adjusted the placement of the 3/4 sleeve, ultramarine silk, cut on the bias so that it fell with a slight, perpetual fluidity, the kind of movement that drew the eye without the wearer having to do anything. "Better," Soline said. She looked at herself in the long mirror, not the way Elodie might have looked at herself, cataloguing assets, calculating effect, rehearsing the expression she planned to wear when others looked at her, but simply as a kind of information. The gown was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was not trying to do anything except exist in the most complete version of itself. She had worn blue at her wedding, a different blue, lighter, warmer, a choice that Theron had never asked about, and she had never explained. She had chosen it because blue, for her, was not a performance color. It was a considered color, a color you wore when you were not trying to convince anyone of anything, because you already knew. "C'est parfait," Genevieve said. Soline agreed. She changed back into her traveling clothes, simple, immaculate, the kind of clothes that looked as though they required no effort and required, in reality, precisely the same amount of money as effort would have, and collected the gown in its garment bag. She thanked Genevieve, who kissed her on both cheeks, and said nothing further about the occasion for which it would be worn, because Genevieve was the kind of woman who understood that some occasions speak for themselves. Soline drove to the Lyon train station. She bought a coffee. She sat in the first-class carriage and looked out the window at the countryside moving past, and she thought, without bitterness or anxiety, about what the evening would require of her. Not much. That was always the answer with Soline. It never required much, in the end. Ever felt like 2 completely different preparations were heading toward the same moment from completely different directions? One loud, one quiet, one performing, one simply arriving. Next is where the legal world enters, and the blue pearl makes its meaning known. The legal notice had arrived at the London apartment on a Tuesday morning, 6 days before the gala. It came in a white envelope with the return address of a firm called Berenson, Aldgate and Roux, solicitors Theron recognized as representing the Whitmore family trust, which meant representing Celine's side of the Whitmore family structure, on the side that predated their marriage and would outlast it regardless of how that marriage ultimately concluded. Elodie had seen it on the entrance hall table when she came back from her morning walk. She had picked it up, noted the formal return address, and set it back down with the studied indifference of someone who has decided that legal matters are entirely outside her personal jurisdiction. This arrived, she had told Theron when he came downstairs. He had taken it without comment and carried it to the study and closed the door. She had gone to make coffee and occupied herself with the decision of whether to use the ivory or the champagne cream table settings for the small dinner she was planning the following week, and she had not thought about the envelope again. Whatever it was, lawyers wrote letters. The lawyers were always writing letters. The world produced a constant low-level ambient noise of legal correspondence that had never, in her experience, amounted to anything personally disruptive. Theron would deal with it in whatever way was appropriate, and that would be that. She was not entirely wrong about this. What she was wrong about was the definition of disruptive. The notice was a formal communication regarding the restructuring of the Whitmore estate holdings. Specifically, it concerned a tranche of assets, including as item 7 in a list of 14, the Whitmore Grand Hotel and its associated commercial properties that had, through the terms of the original family trust, reverted to Celine's direct ownership upon the formalization of her legal separation from Theron. This had occurred, according to the documentation, 11 months ago. The significance of this was not that Theron was in immediate danger of losing everything. The significance was that the thing he had been presenting, implicitly and explicitly, as the source of his financial authority, the thing that had funded the apartment, the dinners, the credit cards, the whole elaborate structure of his current life, was not his to present anymore. He had known this was coming. He had not known exactly when, because lawyers on both sides had been in discussion, and the timing had remained fluid. Now, it was no longer fluid. He sat in the study for a long time, with the letter on the desk in front of him, and he thought about the blue pearl on the mantelpiece, and he felt the particular cold clarity of someone who has been putting off a realization and has finally run out of reasons to put it off any further. Then he called his solicitor. Then he went downstairs and told Elodie they were still going to the gala. 2 days after the legal notice arrived, a package came for Elodie, not delivered by courier, by hand apparently, placed in the building's concierge post without the concierge noticing when it arrived, which was the kind of detail that would have interested her if she'd been paying the right kind of attention. It was a small white box, tied with a thin piece of navy ribbon. Inside, resting on a fold of tissue paper, was a single blue pearl. Not the standard white to cream of cultured pearls. The Mazarine blue, deep and specific and entirely deliberate, with the particular luminescence that comes from a living thing's slow accretion over years. No note. Elodie had turned it over in her fingers, puzzled. "Someone sent this," she said to Theron, who was reading in the sitting room. He looked at it from across the room. His expression did not change. "How curious," he said, in the careful tone of a man who is saying the minimum required. "Who on earth sends a single pearl? No note, no card." "I couldn't say." Elodie had placed it on the windowsill, where the light from the street below made it glow faintly, and she had decided it was probably a mistake, addressed to the wrong apartment, delivered by a confused courier, meant for someone else entirely. The mystery was briefly amusing and then simply forgettable. She had gone back to planning her ensemble. Theron had looked at the pearl on the windowsill for a long time after Elodie left the room. He recognized the gesture. Celine had always liked pearls, not for their decorative quality, but for what she called the patience of them. You couldn't rush a pearl. It required years of quiet, consistent attention to become itself. She had once given him a lecture, or what passed for a lecture, in Celine's conversational style, measured, unhurried, with long pauses between the statements, about the difference between things that were made and things that were grown. She had said that most people couldn't tell the difference at a glance, and that this was fine, because the difference didn't reveal itself at a glance. It revealed itself over time. He had not, when she said it, understood the full weight of what she was telling him. He understood it now. We've all received a message we didn't immediately understand. The pearl was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was a clock, and the clock had now reached its hour. Next is Theron's. The man caught between two truths, finally forced to face the one he chose not to see. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to men who mistake power for connection. It looks from the outside like confidence. It occupies space with the ease of something that has always been there. It speaks in measured, authoritative tones and makes decisions without apparent hesitation, and does not ever let on that beneath its surface is a man who has been searching for something he cannot name in all the wrong kinds of places for a very long time. And Theron Whitmore was 53 years old and had spent the better part of those 53 years being the most important presence in whatever room he entered. This was not arrogance precisely. Arrogance implied a gap between self-assessment and reality, and Theron's assessment was, in most respects, accurate. He was intelligent. He was capable. He had built things, sustained things, navigated complexity with the kind of structural clarity that most people could only admire from the outside. What he had not been able to do, the gap in his considerable arsenal, the one he had spent decades engineering around, rather than addressing, was to remain present with someone he loved after the initial force of his own need had been met. He had needed Celine once, with the specific intensity of a man who recognizes in another person something that fills a space he hadn't known was empty. She had been 28 when they met, already the kind of woman who seemed to occupy her own existence without apparent uncertainty, and this had fascinated him in the way that a perfectly balanced scale fascinates someone who has only ever seen things tip. He had pursued her with every resource he had, and been, he thought, deeply grateful when she accepted. And then, gradually, and with the particular cruelty of things that happen too slowly to confront in the moment, he had stopped paying attention. Not maliciously, not even consciously. He had simply allowed the comfort of her presence to become a background assumption rather than a foreground reality, and he had redirected his considerable energy toward the business of acquiring and managing and expanding, because expansion was something he knew how to do, and intimacy was something he had never learned. Celine had said, in the last real conversation they had before the separation, formalized itself, "I have not asked you to be different. I have asked you to be present. Those are not the same request." He had not had an answer for that. He had Elodie instead, who asked nothing of his inner life because she was too busy managing her own performance to notice that he didn't have one available. He had known, intellectually, that this was a substitute. He had not admitted to himself, until very recently, how thin the substitute was. And standing in the alcove of the ballroom, he had grown up visiting. The parquet floor he had run across as a child, the chandelier he had once, at age 9, thrown a paper airplane at and missed by inches. Theron felt the accumulated weight of several decisions landing on him simultaneously. The legal notice, the pearl, the way the room was arranging itself around him tonight with a slightly different gravitational pull than he expected. He had lived for 20 years alongside a woman who had never needed to perform for anyone. He had chosen instead a woman whose entire existence was a performance. And he was standing in a room that his wife owned, wearing cufflinks she had given him on their 10th anniversary, waiting for the other shoe to drop with the particular helplessness of a man who knows he put it in motion himself. He poured another drink. He thought, she will come tonight. He did not know how he knew this. He simply did, with the certainty of someone who has finally, after too long, stopped lying to himself about what he already understands. He scanned the room. The sequined flash of Elodie across the dance floor. The careful, calibrated movements of people who were choosing, with increasing deliberateness, where to position themselves. The door to the main corridor, which had opened and closed 3 times in the last 20 minutes for late arrivals. He thought about the blue pearl. He thought, patience. He waited. Next is the cruelest moment before the dawn. It is Elodie at her most certain, and therefore at her most vulnerable. Stay with me. At 9:47 in the evening, when Elodie was standing near the gala's entrance foyer, not because she had any particular reason to be there, but because the entrance foyer was where the new arrivals came in, and she liked to be positioned where she could see them, and more importantly, where they could see her. The evening had been going well by her measure. Her dress had received exactly the volume of attention she had anticipated. She had been photographed 3 times by the event's hired photographer and once by someone's phone. She had been introduced to 4 people she hadn't met before and had handled each introduction with the smooth, modulated charm of someone who has practiced social performance long enough for it to feel like second nature. The only faint note of dissonance, and she had been turning it over in her mind without quite acknowledging it as dissonance, was the room's behavior toward Theron. Not openly cold, not rude, nothing she could point to and name, but there was a quality of engagement that was slightly off, a beat of hesitation before men reached to shake his hand, a conversational thinning when he joined a group, not visible from 10 feet away, but perceptible at close range. She had attributed this to business politics, which she found opaque and uninteresting, and had set the observation aside. Now, near the foyer, she encountered Margaret Aldrin. Margaret was 71 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had been formidable at 40 and had simply continued in that direction without stopping. She was wearing a deep green dress that was 20 years out of fashion in the style cycle way and entirely beyond fashion in the actual way, the kind of garment that had never needed to be current because it was simply, unequivocally correct. She was standing near the coat check speaking to the attendant, and she looked up when Elodie approached. "Good evening," Elodie said, with the automatic warmth she deployed for people she needed to be gracious toward. Margaret Aldrin looked at her with the mild, undisturbed expression of someone who has seen this particular type of person many times and finds them neither interesting nor threatening. "Good evening." "Wonderful event, isn't it?" Elodie continued. "I was just thinking the florals are rather overdone, but the room itself is magnificent." "It is," Margaret agreed. I've known it a long time." "Oh, you're a regular?" "My friendship with the family predates the renovation," Margaret said, which was true. She had been one of Celine's mother's closest friends and had watched Celine grow up with the proprietary affection of a godparent. and was here tonight at Soline's specific request, which Elodie could not have known and would not have thought to consider. There was a brief pause. "And you are?" Margaret asked, though she knew perfectly well. "Elodie Voss," Elodie said, with the pleasant confidence of someone introducing a name that should be recognized. "I'm here with Theron." Margaret's expression did not change. "I see," she said. This response, so brief, so utterly without the registering of importance that Elodie had expected, irritated her more than she wanted to admit. There was something insufferable, she felt, about people who refused to be impressed, who stood in rooms like this, in dresses like that, and offered nothing more than "I see," as though they hadn't heard the name at all. "I imagine you know the family well," Elodie said, pushing slightly. "I know Celine," Margaret said pleasantly. "Very well, for 30 years. "Yes, I'm sure she's lovely," Elodie said, managing to pack into 2 words the complete dismissal of someone who has decided the subject is not worth exploring. Margaret Aldrin looked at her for a moment with an expression Elodie would later, in private, replay several times without being able to name. It was not contempt. It was not pity. It was something quieter than either. The faint sadness of someone watching a very young, a very confident swimmer walk into water they don't know is deep. "I'm sure you'll see for yourself," Margaret said, "before the evening is over." She excused herself and moved back into the ballroom. Elodie stood in the foyer and felt, for the first time all evening, the first feather-light touch of unease. Not enough to name, not enough to act on. But there, a flutter in the otherwise solid construction of her confidence, a breath of cold from somewhere she couldn't identify. She smoothed the front of her gown. 6,000 hand-stitched sequins catching the foyer light. She lifted her chin. She walked back into the ballroom. The next moment is the one everything has been building toward. Not with a crash, not loudly, with the particular, undeniable authority of a woman who has been patient long enough. Next is the revelation. At 10 minutes past 10, the main doors of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom opened. There was no announcement, no usher, no herald, no formality. The doors simply opened. The large paneled doors at the northern end of the room, the ones that connected to the estate's private residential wing, and a woman walked in. She walked in the way people walk into rooms they own, which is to say, without particular fanfare or hesitation, but with a quality of movement that drew the eye regardless of intent. This was not a performance of entry. It was simply an entry, which is an entirely different thing, and the distinction was visible to everyone in the room, though most of them would have been unable to articulate precisely what they were responding to. What they were responding to, in part, was the gown. It moved with her from the doorway, and the word that kept arriving later, when people tried to describe what they had seen, was moved, because it did not hang from her, or drape across her, or sit upon her the way fabric sits on a form. It moved with her, which meant it had been constructed to do precisely that, and the construction was visible in every line of it for anyone with eyes trained to see it. The color hit the room like a tuning fork struck against crystal, pure, resonant, and exactly right. Mazarine blue, deep as an evening sky past the last of the light, possessed of the particular quality of colors that have their own history, their own pedigree, their own name. The silk blend jacquard caught the chandelier light, not by throwing it back the way sequins throw it, but by absorbing and warming it, thus so that the gown seemed lit from within, rather than from without. The structured bodice moved into the long skirt with the seamless confidence of a line that knew where it was going, and the bias-cut sleeves fell from the arm with a perpetual, unhurried motion that was almost meditative to watch. The French seams were invisible, of course. That was the point. The seams were encased so completely, finished so painstakingly, that the gown appeared to have been created without construction, as though it had simply arrived whole without anyone having to make it. This was the most expensive thing about it, and the least visible, and therefore the most telling. The pearls, one at each ear, Mazarine blue, unmistakably matched to the silk, completed the composition with the quiet authority of a final sentence that needed no exclamation mark. She wore no other jewelry. She wore no expression that required reading. She simply looked like herself, and the room recognized this with the collective, immediate response of people who have been in the presence of performed beauty all evening and have now, without warning, encountered the real thing. The silence came gradually and then completely, not the silence of rudeness or of shock in its theatrical sense, the silence of a room that has recalibrated, that has reoriented its understanding of what the evening is actually about. People turned without deciding to turn. Conversations trailed off without their participants noticing they had stopped speaking. The string quartet, which had moved from Debussy to a soft arrangement of something classical and unobtrusive, continued playing, but even those who had been unconsciously registering it as background texture stopped registering it, because there was something else to register now. Margaret Aldrin, near the drinks table, put down her glass and smiled with the warmth of someone welcoming home something that had been away too long. Fletcher Rowe, near the fireplace alcove, straightened slightly and allowed himself the smallest possible nod of what a careful observer would have identified as deep satisfaction. The property developer, who had been standing near Elodie earlier in the evening, crossed the room in a direction that was not accidental, positioning himself with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment to arrive. Theron saw her from across the room. He was not surprised. He had been waiting for this without knowing that he was waiting for this, and the sight of her standing in the northern doorway, serene, in blue, composed as a winter morning, landed on him not as a shock, but as a clarification. The way a diagnosis lands. Not new information exactly, but the naming of something that has been present all along. He set down his glass. He did not move toward her. He understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that this was not his moment. Elodie was standing near the center of the ballroom when the silence arrived. She felt it before she understood it. The way you feel the change in air pressure before a storm. The subtle shift in the room's attention that was oriented, she realized with the first cold touch of actual anxiety, not toward her. She was the brightest thing in the room, and she was wearing 6,000 sequins. She was standing in the exact center, perfectly positioned to receive whatever the room was offering. And the room was offering nothing to her. The room's attention had moved. Entirely, completely without apology, it had moved to the woman in the blue gown, who was now walking, unhurried, without performance, from the northern doorway toward the center of the space. People made way without being asked. Not theatrical parting, not deliberate social choreography, simply the natural movement of people who are realigning themselves around a gravitational center. Elodie looked at her. She registered the gown first, because the gown was what there was to register. The Mazarine blue against the chandelier light, the architecture of it, the way it moved. And then she registered the woman wearing it, the composure, the complete absence of performance, the face that was not young in the way that Elodie's was maintained to be young, but that had the quality of something that has been lived in carefully and is therefore more interesting than anything that hasn't been lived in at all. She registered with the particular intelligence of a woman who has always survived on social instinct, that everyone in the room knew who this was. She registered that she did not. And then Margaret Aldrin appeared at the woman's side, and the warmth of the greeting between them, the unhurried embrace, the genuine ease of 30 years of friendship, told Elodie something that the gown had already begun to suggest. She turned to find Theron. Theron was already looking at her, and at the woman he had finally and irrevocably brought into the same room. His expression told her everything. The truth has a sound. It's the sound of a room going quiet for the right person. Stay with me for one more, the one where justice is quiet, complete, and leaves no loose ends. What followed was not a scene. This is important to understand, because scenes require performance, and performance requires at least one participant willing to be dramatic, and Celine Whitmore was constitutionally incapable of drama in the theatrical sense. She moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, with the quality of attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what she finds there, without the quality of performance of someone who needs to be seen finding it. She spoke to people. She was warmly and specifically greeted by people who had known her for years, some of whom had been navigating this evening with the slightly uncomfortable awareness of a guest who has been seated in someone else's chair and is not sure when the real occupant will return to reclaim it. The relief in their greetings was visible and genuine. She accepted a glass of water from a server and thanked him by name. She knew the staff, had always known the staff, had the particular quality of wealthy people who understand that the people serving them are people. And she moved through the social architecture of the room without claiming it and without needing to, because it was already hers. At some point, and this happened without announcement, without confrontation, and with the elegant efficiency of a well-managed organization, a man in a dark suit approached Elodie. He was not unkind. He was not theatrical. He spoke to her in low, measured tones, close enough that the conversation remained private, and what he said, in the careful language of someone who has been trained to manage exactly this kind of situation without creating a scene, was approximately this: that the Whitmore estate was under new management, effective immediately, and that certain hosting arrangements for this evening had accordingly been revised, and that he was available to arrange a car for her if she would like to make her way out through the private corridor, which would allow for a discreet departure. Elodie said something in response. What she said is not worth recording here, because it was the kind of thing that people say when they realize too late that the ground beneath them was never theirs, and the words were more sound than meaning. Anger and disbelief, and the particular wounded indignation of a person who has mistaken access for ownership and is now experiencing the correction of that mistake. The man in the dark suit listened with the infinite patience of someone who has heard all versions of this response before, and when she had finished, he said simply, "The car is whenever you're ready." She went. Not immediately. There were several minutes of stillness near the drinks table, during which she looked across the room at Theron, who was standing with two men near the fireplace alcove and was not looking back at her, and during which she processed, "It's with the speed of someone whose survival instincts are actually very finely tuned, even when they are aimed in the wrong direction," the full shape of what had happened. She went through the private corridor. She did not make a scene. She was not whatever her other qualities without a certain kind of pride, and the pride would not let her perform collapse in a public space. The car took her to the London apartment. She would discover the following morning that her access codes had been changed. This was not unexpected once she thought about it. Celine, for her part, spent the remainder of the evening doing what she had come to do. She met with the estate's legal representatives, who had been waiting in the private office adjoining the ballroom, and reviewed documentation with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood exactly what the papers contained and required only the formality of signatures. She spoke with Fletcher Rowe, who offered his quiet congratulations with the warmth of a man who had been hoping for this outcome for some time. She drank her water and, later, a single glass of something light and cold, and she looked out at the room that her family had built and her mother had loved and that she had been patient enough to wait for. She did not feel triumph. Triumph was for people who had needed the fight to be about something. For Celine, this had never been a fight. It had been a matter of time and paperwork and the quiet, inexorable forward motion of things arranged correctly from the beginning. She thought about her mother, who had told her once, standing in this very room, in a different season, when the light came through the west windows in the late afternoon and turned the parquet to something like gold, that the Whitmore name was not the building and not the money and not even the history. It was the quality of attention you brought to what you'd been given. Whether you held it carefully, whether you grew it, or simply spent it. She thought her mother would have found the evening satisfying. Near 11, she found herself standing near the east window, the same spot where she had stood at the beginning of the evening, before her dress change, before the entrance, before the room had known she was there in any capacity other than a quiet woman in grey who might have been anyone. Margaret found her there. "Well," Margaret said, and standing at her side and looking out at the room. "Well," Celine agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the particular silence of two women who have known each other long enough to have no need to fill space. "The gown is extraordinary," Margaret said. "Genevieve," Celine confirmed. "Of course." A pause. "He was watching you all evening." Celine did not ask which he. There was only one he in this context, and they both knew it. "I know." "And?" Celine turned the water glass in her hands. The pearl earrings caught the chandelier light and held it the way pearls hold things, not throwing it back aggressively, but absorbing it, becoming lit, becoming themselves. And nothing. He made choices. I made choices. The difference is that mine were in the paperwork. Margaret laughed, low and genuine. What happens now?" Margaret asked. Celine looked at the room, the restored plasterwork, the parquet floor, the chandelier that had hung in this exact position since 1923, and felt something that was not triumph and was not sadness and was not nostalgia, but was perhaps a combination of the three transformed by time into something more like peace, the specific peace of a woman who has been patient long enough to arrive at the thing she was always going to arrive at, and has found it intact. "Now," she said, "we run a good hotel." Margaret lifted her glass. The string quartet in the corner, who had continued playing through all of it, moved into a final, soft piece, something that asked nothing of its listeners and offered everything, and the way music does when it's played by people who remember that it's for the room and not for themselves. The chandelier light moved across the parquet. The Mazarine gown caught it and held it. The evening continued. And that is where we leave her. Not standing over the ruins of anything, because Celine Whitmore is not that kind of woman. She is the kind of woman who builds, quietly and completely, while others are busy performing. The kind of woman who wears blue not to be seen, but because it is the truest color she knows. Power isn't found in a price tag. It isn't found in 6,000 sequins or a champagne entrance or the loudest laugh in the room. It is found in the person who doesn't need to shout to be heard, who walks into a room she owns and doesn't announce it, because the room already knows. What stayed with you most? The moment the room went silent, or the moment she stood at the east window and no one yet understood who she was? Leave your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who believes that patience is its own kind of power.